There are two complexes that are captured by two questions. The complexes correspond to what the question is aiming to answer. They are complexes because they are phenomena in the world that are principles and properties of consciousness. And the two questions that elucidate the outline of the two complexes of consciousness asks the following. Disclosed within your subjective point of view and out from that are objective facts and objects of facts that take on their own independent subsistence, each holding its own variable ground. And these ultimately are all different objects disclosed within your own conception of the world. And so you look out into the world and you see cars driving by and a fence over here and a man walking over there and a tree here and the sky is up there, and all these are different variables and objects disclosed within your perspective of them, within your consciousness and awareness of them. But outside of this single unified consciousness of different things, the opposite of this self-identical substance, the opposite of this is that where this universal conception of the world originates and comes out of, the source of its origination is an object disclosed within the conception of some other point of origination of consciousness. And so just like a particular guy or a girl or a man or whoever you want to call it is disclosed within your conception, you are an object also in their conception. Now think about this claim. You are disclosed within a different conception, not just as an object among other objects within a conception. You are disclosed by the conception of the other, and therefore the other on an indirect degree determines the conditions and the particular event that you find yourself in, just like you also determine the event and conditions that you yourself exist as an object in the conception of the other. Did you follow me there? Probably not. But listen to what I am trying to tell you here. Just like you are an object in the conception of somebody else. I mean, they see you as a guy, but you don't see yourself as a guy. You're looking out from yourself and you're seeing him as a guy. And therefore he's an object in your conception. You see, when he's an object in your conception, he's just one object among every other object. But you, as the source from which this conception originates and arrives from, is also an object in some other conception. And so this paradox of consciousness, and the reason why it's called a complex, and I originally stated there are two complexes. One is that things belong to your conception, and the second complex, the inverse of it, it's the same, it's the same complex but inversed, and therefore it's a different complex. A second one takes on a different form. is that you are also an object in someone else's conception. They're an object in your conception, and you're an object in their conception. And therefore you can determine your own conception, and therefore the objects within your conception. And you're also determined as an object in someone else's conception by their conception of different objects. And this crazy logic is not all that nebulous, as we say. It's not that out there when we apply it in the scientific domain. In fact, in the scientific domain, it constitutes the very logical basis of quantum mechanics, or what we mean by quantum science as a general. Because quantum mechanics, is only a subject matter, a specific subsection of quantum science generally. Mechanics of quantum, what we take to be mechanical, but yet unpredictable operations of nature at the fundamental subatomic level and beyond, belongs to an ontology of the world, which sees the world as not limited to the particular perspective and the point of view originating from the individual, whether it be their senses of the world or how motion operates in relation to their evolved, perception of the world. Whether, you hear some things in a certain way or see something in a certain way. That way in which you see things derived from your organs of sensation is not static as it appears, but more dynamic and fundamentally changing as well. And so it is the same dilemma in philosophy which asks if a tree falls in the forest and nobody's there to see it, did it fall? Did it happen? If a tree fell and nobody was there to hear it, did it happen? From a quantum scientific point of view, an event outside of the observer both happened and did not happen simultaneously. Or in other words, the event at the same time happened in the way that you assumed it to happen and happened in a way that you did not assume it, or happened in a different way. And therefore, the science of quantum mechanics makes the observer an indivisible principle from the phenomenon. Outside of the observer, the tree both fell and not fell. The branch broke and fell to the ground, and it did not fall and still stayed the same. It is all these possibilities simultaneously, and they're disclosed within the same space. It doesn't have to be, an illogical idea. I mean, they're two different events taking on two different positions in space. One tree fell, one tree's up. And the forest consists of this structure. Now the question is this forest outside of anybody's conception? Does it exist if nobody's looking at it at all? Fundamentally, yes, it wouldn't be able to exist if nothing was able to perceive it. But there's something perceiving it, you just don't know what it is. There's something perceiving the forest. The forest is an object in the conception of an unknown being, of an unknown observer. Whether it be bacteria or, mitochondria, or what do you want to call it? Like you are the conception of your mitochondria, to some degree. You are looking at the conception of something else. You're looking at the object in the conception of something else. And that's why it's always maintained. Have you ever thought there's always somebody somewhere? There's always somebody somewhere, Wherever you go, there's somebody there. Haven't you noticed that? There's no place where nobody's not there. Or a thing is not there. Oh, well, Mars is. Well, how do you know? Or the moon. Well, maybe it's an object in the conception of something else. Did the tree fall if nobody saw it? How could we know? You wouldn't know. If you were not looking at it, you wouldn't know whether it fell or not. It's both. It's potentially fell and potentially not. This phenomena in quantum mechanics is called the Schrödinger Cat, which is a way more startling and astonishing observation of the world at a fundamental level than the name grants it to be. The experiment, the Schrödinger experiment, produces one of the craziest and mind-startling observations about the universe. And it simply goes like this. Demonstrated by a silly experiment. If we get a cat in a box, and there's a switch in that box that activates some kind of monoxide or some kind of carbon dioxide substance that cuts off the oxygen supply of the cat, and you pretty much produce an absurd situation where you ultimately produce a scenario where it's inevitable that it happens, that it is inevitable that the scenario you're producing will happen. Like, of course, if you put a trigger in a box, the cat at one point will trigger it and therefore cause its own demise and death. It's only a matter of time before it does so. What is that law called in the universe? If it can happen, it does happen. If it can happen, it does. Murphy's Law. It's called Murphy's Law. Anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Or if it can happen, it does happen. In other words, that's my paraphrasing of it. You don't have to take it in a negative sense. If it could go wrong, it does go wrong. What if it can go right? Does it go right? No. Schrödinger's cat. They say it's a thought experiment that illustrates a fundamental paradox in quantum known as superposition. The possibility where ideas take on parallel realities. And in these parallel realities are disclosed the same event in inverse ways. But this inverse way has a duration of time, and it goes forward in time. And ultimately, you are both dead and alive from a superposition point of view. But from a linear point in time, you're at one point alive and at one point dead. You have to be. If you're dead, you're not alive. And if you're alive, you're not dead. But you will die, and you have to be alive in order to die. And so we're experiencing our life in this continuous duration, starting from an initial point and transitioning into an end point where change is observed completely. And we sit in this moment. And the moment we are sitting in has this complex dual nature, that things are objects in your conception and you are an object in something else's conception. That man is an object in your perspective, in your perception, and you are an object in his perception. And if you are an object in someone else's perception, then they on some level determine your reality and your circumstances that you are in. And vice versa, you ultimately also determine the reality of the objects within your conception. Some of these objects are other people. And it is this tension of these two inverse point of view of the observer. These perspectives derive from the consciousness of the observer in determining the world. And they are both true and not true at the same time. And the observer determines one over the other at one given point in time. Now, the cat experiment is not as simple as it quite may seem. It's actually way more complex than it might seem, because the results it produces are completely complex. And it's complex because it relies on this. The Schrödinger's cat ultimately relies on placing an object disclosed within some kind of physical matter, and that physical matter or substance must somehow make it impossible for the observation to determine any particular reality. So it cuts out any possible observer. You know, you can't hear the object, you can't see it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it, you can't feel it, you can't even think about it. You can't even think about the thing. You're in such a level of uncertainty about the nature of the object, about what the nature of the object might be, that the object stands alone, entirely independent from an observer, or that its relation with an observer is that it is entirely unobserved and independent from the observer. And what happens when an object is placed in those conditions, in those circumstances where it is completely made divisible from the observer, is that the object itself ultimately develops a different dimensional magnitude. Or rather, you just disclosed it within a different dimension. It's a different dimension. Because the object cannot not be observed by a particular observer within its dimension. It has to be. It has to be observed by anything. It has to be observed by a bug or anything. And if you cut off any possible observer within its dimension, it literally moves on into a different dimension, where it can actually be determined one way or the other, or both ways, or none. It has to be determined in any possible way or no way at all. It has to be a certain way. It has to be a way, whether it is one way or no way, or that no way being different way. And therefore, you literally encapsulate an object, separate from the observer, into a different dimension, observed by an unknown observer, by God knows what observer. And from your observer, from your position, an object completely independent and isolated from your awareness and consciousness of it, is both things simultaneously at the same time. It is all things at the same time. And that is what is disclosed at the most fundamental subatomic level that quantum mechanics is trying to elucidate. It is the dimension at the very end of any physical structure, any point in matter. Deep, deep, deep within the circumference of a black hole, or rather, a Schwarzschild radius. The black hole in every object. That point that when you go really deep into the object and past its subatomic structures, which ultimately are different dimensional objects maintaining a conception of you as an object in their conception, or you as an object as just an object in general, what you assume to yourself to be as an objective phenomenon in the world, observed as you are for other things. Because you are observed as you are for other things. And so this influx of different objects being observed by different observers, and each observer is now an object in the conception of a different observer, should not produce an absolute relativism in the world. It shouldn't resort to a conclusion that the world is just relativity. My view is my view and your view is your view, and we absolutely have no access to each other's point of view, that we have no shared common point of view, except the point of view that we have no shared common point of view. You then commit an affirmative contradiction. You affirm the thing by denying it. You make the thing true by claiming it is untrue. The non-being of a thing is ultimately becomes its very being, and therefore there always has to be a being. You can't presuppose non-being when you have a being, or you can't presuppose being when you have non-being, because the second you said something is non-existence or does not exist, then you ultimately assume that at one point it must exist, or there is a thing that is like that now doesn't exist, or it just doesn't exist at all. And so you watch things moving in a certain way out and about, but try going on your bike really fast, and all of a sudden the elementary physics of the world all of a sudden becomes a little bit different. It's harder to focus. You gotta distance becomes a little bit warped. Things come at you faster. There's a chance of you hitting something and you being in an impact at a greater force with other objects, and therefore break your body. Go on a plane and go all the way as far as a plane can go. Time all of a sudden changes. You can get from one country to another within, 9 hours, where if you walked it would be like freaking months. Distance determines time on some level. All these properties which we take to be relativistic are actually the very objective facts about the world. Or that relativism fails in recognizing one important aspect that constitutes the difference of anything in relation to anything else, or all things in relation to each other, is that their very difference, the very point that makes them advantageous as a unique object in the perspective of the world, it just makes them unique in general in relation to other things. That very point that we claim to be the argument for things to be completely unrelated and relative from each other is in fact their very objective fact that is being presented to other things. You see things as they are in themselves. You see things as how things want to be perceived. You are seeing how the thing sees itself, and therefore it's exhibiting that conception of itself to you as an objective phenomenon. And you look at that objective phenomenon and say, wow, that is a different thing than me. And in fact, all these things are different things from each other, and they're all contained within this common shared substance, which is my conception of them. But my conception of them is ultimately disclosed by an object that is just one among many of them that are disclosed by the conception of some other object, which hosts the conception that discloses other things that are different from each other. And when there is no conception conceiving any two objects to be different from another, and therefore those two objects to be different from an innumerable number of other objects, if we enter that conception which has that ultimate level of uncertainty in the universe, you produce the conception of absolute indeterminacy, of just things that are all the same in being completely unrecognizable and ununique and not differentiated. Things become undifferentiated. They become indifferent to one another. And therefore, this is the quantum state that superposition is talking about. It is the state, I call it, of consciousness that the Schrödinger's cat proves and demonstrates. And it is the thing happening in your mind. But you are an object in someone else's mind. And therefore you have to battle his perception of you. And that influence on your perception of yourself. And you are in this life determined by the perception of others about who you are and how you see yourself and exhibit that to others.